Welcome back to Statement Piece. Today we have a very special guest, Nethmi Nawaratha. She is a second year at Monash University, getting a Bachelor's of Law and Science, and she is also a host of the podcast Culture Critic, which has a lot of very interesting hot takes in the pop culture space.
Yes, so recently we were welcomed onto her podcast and discussed some gender roles within the fashion industry, and then we started with discussing Harry Styles' Vogue cover. Quite an interesting conversation. Check it out if you'd like to hear more. But today we would like to discuss a little bit of gender roles and the differences between, I guess, the American society and Australian society, since you come from Australia. So I guess, like, when you first think of gender roles, what does that really mean to you?
I think gender roles, it's integrated, it affects like every aspect of life. And it's interesting because when you like initially ask me that question, in my head I'm like, oh, it's not something that really comes to mind, it's not something that I really think about. But upon critical analysis, you realize it really does pervade into every aspect of life, just like socially, but also you see it in pop culture and media, and you see it in the workplace. Yeah, for sure. But I also think it's interesting to look at the ways in which the cultural element and where you live and your nationality, how that also affects gender roles as well, because I know as a South Asian, that has significant impact on the way in which I view gender as opposed to perhaps those of a different ethnicity.
It's interesting that in Australia and the UK, I feel like when people say Asian, they generally think of South Asian. But in the United States, when people say Asian, they generally think of Eastern Asian.
Yeah, for sure. It's really, I don't know. Um, I would agree, but I also think there is a level of that in Australia as well. And like, it's funny because we use the word Asian to generalize Asians, but then we still forget a huge like aspect of the Asian community, which is just so funny to me. Like, we're doing racism wrong, but we're generalizing badly in a way. Do you get what I'm saying? It's just funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you mentioned that your South Asian background sort of influences your perspective on gender roles. Do you mind explaining a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So like, my parents are first generation immigrants. So they came, both my parents were born in Sri Lanka and then they migrated here for work. And it's interesting to look at the divide between my parents' generation and my own generation in terms of, you know, back in certain Eastern countries, there's more traditional gender roles, and those are gender roles that my parents' generation were the first to kind of really break out of, in the sense of like my mother being able to study and pursue her own career and come to another foreign country. Like, that's something very new for her and for her and like her community in general. Like, I think it's like really the first generation where women have had the ability to do that. But still, I feel like regressive is not the right word, but there's a more traditional gender role there in terms of stereotypes: who does the cooking, who does the cleaning, who takes care of the house, who's the primary money maker, things like that. And it's funny because when we migrated here, our parents obviously have had to adapt to like the Western way of viewing gender roles, and a more of a blur between what men do and what women do, which is like a very binary way of thinking. But they've had to kind of change their mindset, and we've grown up with this new, more modern mindset where gender roles are more blurred. But it's interesting to somehow like call out your parents on kind of more traditional gender roles. So like, for example, sometimes my mum will be like, wow, like, you know, you're growing up and you're a woman, like, why don't you know how to cook? And then I'll just call out my mum and I'll be like, but why does it matter that I'm a woman and I don't know how to cook? You know what I mean? Like, little things like that, that they kind of fall back into the trap on, and we kind of call out our parents on it. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think kind of having that South Asian background has impacted the way that you consume media and content in general? Like, were your parents ever specific about what you were allowed to watch or read and stuff like that?
For sure. I mean, maybe not so much anymore because I don't think they have the authority to do that, but definitely when I was a kid, and I think a lot of like South Asians can relate to this in terms of a lot of monitoring on what we can and can't consume. Um, I remember like my parents thought I don't know do you guys have The Simpsons in America? Is that like, yeah, like my parents thought that was like the worst thing ever, and like Adventure Time, they hated those shows. They wouldn't let us watch them as a kid because they thought that they were, I don't know, vulgar, inappropriate or something.
Just
Which
like crude in general. I feel like when my family first moved to North America, for us at the age that we were at, it was SpongeBob. Like
oh
my family just couldn't understand why it was so popular, and it was a children's TV show because just the way that the characters are portrayed, like there
yeah,
isn't anything that's particularly, I guess the best way to put it is like proper. But
no,
it's indeed very American.
yeah, there was such a weird like not taboo. It was just I never understood the mindset, especially since they're like cartoons. I couldn't fathom why we weren't allowed to watch it, but it was fine because not fine. I mean, it didn't matter anyways because this is my personal opinion, restrictive parents breed secretive kids, right? Like that's just kind of how it works. So I found that even though there was a lot of restrictions on the media that we couldn't and could consume, it didn't matter anyways because we'd find some kind of way to do it. Like, yeah.
Yeah. So, did you find that you grew up with a certain predisposition to certain cultures, I guess, or an assumptions about different cultures, and specifically American pop culture?
Um, Maybe not because I did come here when I was very young. Like I don't think I lived in Sri Lanka, and before that I actually lived in Japan. Like that's where I was
Mm,
born. So I didn't come here with like a very like ingrained mindset of what I deemed Western culture to be. I think a lot of my frustration and a lot of my predisposition came towards um, seeing how like Eastern and like Southeastern culture was portrayed in the Western media and looking at like how our representation was it was lacking, and when it did exist it was very stereotypical and not necessarily an accurate representation. I think that's more where um, my background influenced how I like perceived the media.
Would you say there is a difference between like American and Australian content that either you consumed while growing up? Because I know The Simpsons and Adventure Time are both two American cartoons. But sorry, going back to the question, were there any differences that you've noticed between American and Australian content, or your own opinions about them?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because like when I asked you, do they have like The Simpsons and stuff in America? I think that speaks to the fact that often I'm unaware of like like the difference between American media and like Australian media because so much of it is intertwined, and a lot of the media we consume in Australia is like American TV shows and movies, etc. That being said, for sure there's a difference. I think a lot of our reality TV is very different to America, and a lot of our franchises are like adaptations of American franchises or British franchises. Uh, a lot of our like soap operas and like TV dramas, they're all very how do I put this? They seem very homegrown. I don't know if that's the right word. It's very low budget, recycled actors. Like if there's an Australian actor, you know that they are in every single Australian soap opera that there is. It's very white compared to like American media. Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you think about it, there's a lot of difference, but those are probably the main things I would say. Yeah.
Going back to this conversation, I was just wondering, because obviously I didn't grow up in Australia or anything, but is there a lot of content around like the Aboriginal populations there?
Um, to be honest, not when we were growing up, for sure. I think there was actually one TV show. We had like this TV channel called like ABC3, and that was like the pinnacle of like um kids to young teens, like our TV shows and stuff that we consumed. There was one show called Move It Mob Style from memory, and it was this show about different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who danced, and it was like a dance TV show where they would teach you different dances based on like the traditional dancing of the specific country and the specific tribe. And I thought that was like so refreshing, especially growing up. That was like the only clear example of Indigenous TV shows that I can really think of that are like solely based on like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Yeah, it definitely wasn't touched on that much. I think nowadays it's different. There's a lot of movies, like we had The Sapphires, which was a huge hit, which was like an all Indigenous cast. And there's a lot of new media coming out that's like very focused on an all Indigenous cast, but for sure, not while we were growing up, no. I'm not sure, is that the same in America in terms of like a lot of media with Indigenous people, or not really?
I would say there's not anything that's particularly focused towards it. I was curious about Indigenous representation in media in Australia because a lot of people would tell me that in fact there's a lot of racism towards, in particular, the Indigenous communities.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one big debate that we have at the moment is about Australia Day, which is our national day of celebration on January the 26th, which is the day when Australia was invaded by the British and marked the beginning of genocide and colonization. I think it's really interesting that people say that like America is a lot more polarized and racist than like Australia or Britain, because as an Australian, I'm actually inclined to disagree. I think perhaps it's not as blatantly obvious, but I think that's because we're not having those conversations like you guys are in the States. Also, I think because the Indigenous population predominantly are in like the Northern Territory, a lot of our population, Indigenous population, is still centered obviously in their like respective country and in the Northern Territory. So I know me personally, I don't have any Indigenous in any friends of Indigenous heritage. Or at my high school, we had 3 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. So they're still, it's still definitely a minority group in Australia, but I definitely don't think there's less racism in Australia. I think it's just more swept under the rug, for sure. Yeah, when Black Lives Matter happened, it was interesting because you had a lot of Australian influencers post the Black Square, etc., and talk about Black Lives Matter, but they failed to recognise that this is an issue that's like tangible in Australia, because Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal and Torres Strait people are Black. Mm-hmm. And even though we were focusing on this movement and these topics that are more American, it's directly transferable to Australia's treatment of Indigenous Australians. And yet that was like a disconnect that was clearly apparent when we had Black Lives Matter protests that was centered around Indigenous Australians, and changing the date and looking at overrepresentation and incarceration and different issues that affect Indigenous Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But yeah, for sure, it was like a same issue, different font, same text, different font type situation. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I know you spoke about influencer behavior and interaction to social justice issues. So how do you find that influencers differ when they're Australia-based versus US-based, or do you find them to be really similar?
I think it's important to note that a lot of Australian influencers don't have as much reach as American influencers, and probably don't have the same platform. But with that, I think there comes a lack of social pressure to speak on different issues. So obviously this is all my personal opinion, but I do think objectively I can say that a lot of Australian influencers don't speak on different issues, and when they do, it's a lot of virtue signaling and performative activism. I genuinely can't think of a single very famous Australian influencer that is very involved in activism.
Yeah. Who would you say is the most famous Australian influencer?
Oh my gosh, it's such an interesting question because I think a lot of Australian influencers moved to LA and
Mm.
like
I was just about to ask that. Like, what are your opinions on people from Australia trying to make it in LA or the US?
I mean, yeah, I can understand that for sure because the reach in Australia is nowhere near as big as like in America and in the US. But with that comes a lack of, it seems stupid to say a lack of Australian representation. Um, but yeah, there's definitely a lack of like clear Australian influences that aren't kind of between the two countries.
Mm.
Um, we have like we have a lot of Australian influences, like a lot of health and wellness type influences.
Mm-hmm.
So like our Shani Grimmins, Chloe Zepp. I'm not sure if any of these names are familiar to you.
I know Shawnee. I've watched I used to watch a lot of her YouTube videos.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
Shani and like Michael Finch. Like
Mhm.
that's what I'd consider Australian influences to consist of. Like
Yeah.
Sarah's Day.
Yeah.
Um,
I
a
love
lot of
Sarah's Day.
yeah. I have a lot of opinions on Sarah's Day. That's a whole other episode that I could do
Mm-hmm.
for sure. Yeah, it's very different, and we have like Anna Paul, and like that's like another brand of influencer. It's like very different, but definitely they don't have as much reach as
Mm.
American influencers, and that's the reasoning for a lot of them moving to LA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you feel about people like Harry Jowsey representing Australia? Like, I see him as like what Catherine calls like an LA transplant. Like, they're from somewhere and use that as their kind of like figurehead in LA to kind of get ahead, but then they adopt the complete LA culture.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, for sure. No one looks at Harry and thinks, "Oh wow, he's a true Aussie." Like, there's there's no correlation. Also, on the topic of celebrities, what's his name from the Kissing Booth?
Oh, Jacob Elordi.
Michael Bellotti. Yeah, so he's an Australian. He actually grew up maybe like within 25 kilometers of me. He went to a notorious private school called St. Kevin's, which is a notorious boys' private school they've gotten into a bit of controversy in the past and have quite a reputation. So it's very interesting to see Jacob, who's a St. Kev's boy,
Date
become a part.
around with Zendaya and Kaya.
Yeah, oh, it was so funny because we make the running joke like Zendaya's dating a St. Kev's boy, which is it's just hilarious because yeah, St. Kev's has a reputation for sure, and it's not one that's necessarily aligned with Zendaya and her message and her morals. Yeah, yeah, like the celebrity hotspot is Byron Bay
Mm-hmm.
in terms of them buying holiday houses and kind of moving out there. Which is for sure it's like a it's an epicenter of like the beach culture and like the hippie lifestyle, you could say. It was also the epicenter of coronavirus, and like anti-vaxxers come from there, and like it's a very specific type of culture which I think maybe a lot of celebrities and influencers are attracted to, that kind of lifestyle, like that carefree.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I always thought how when I traveled to other countries, I was surprised how much they covered American media. But in terms of pop culture, I always wonder why people prescribe to American pop culture in particular. So I was looking at this US News article called Best Countries for Cultural Influence. And so they did a 2020 ranking. They formed a partnership with a research group, BAV Group, and then a global marketing communications company, BMLY and R. And then they surveyed 20,000 people based on cultural significance in terms of entertainment, fashion, happiness, influential culture, and being modern, prestigious, and trendy. And the cultural influence rankings in terms of country, number 1 was Italy, number 2 was France, then Spain, and then the US, then the UK, Japan, Brazil, and then Australia. So I just thought that was kind of interesting because I guess I would have assumed, I mean, this is just my American centric mindset, but I would have assumed that the US would be first. But I guess why do you think people prescribe to American pop culture?
I think, and I don't want this to come across as like offensive or anything.
No, I think since you're known for hot takes, I want to hear it.
um, you mentioned that a lot of European countries are kind of up there in terms of that
Yeah.
ranking. I think maybe that has to do with a lot more of highbrow pop culture. Like that's where that influence comes from. Whereas I think America is very much the lowbrow pop culture, which is not a bad thing at all, but that's just kind of I think what's been established as like a more relatable type of pop culture and a more as opposed to like a more like sophistication out of reach type of like a very accessible pop culture and media. And I think that's why America feels, also the fact that there is like, it is a diverse country, I think that makes the culture, pop culture, easily transferable, because it feels like it can apply to any kind of Western society that is also cultured.
I took this class in college that was America Through French Eyes, and it was all about globalization and American culture and how it was adapted and portrayed in France, and then kind of like vice versa, and how it was tied with globalization. And it was really interesting because then a lot of racial roles that were propagated in the United States were actually then translated to different cultural dynamics in France, where I mean, I feel like a lot of people would consider like old art and a lot of old, like where there are a lot of origins for different art forms and like traditional art, I guess. So I always thought that was really interesting. But also, I think one reason why, if you see as like Eastern culture and then Western culture, if you think about Hollywood, the majority of money is being like shoveled there, and everyone thinks like that's the place to be if you want to be in a movie or TV or something. Like even when we're talking about influencers, most of them moving to LA. And then I think about in India, for example, like there are so many reinterpretations of American films and TV and Bollywood. So it's like the original American story or whatever doesn't exist anymore, and they make their own adaptations, which I always think is really interesting. Because I don't think it's that they're not resistant to American culture, but it's more so that they kind of find their own form. Because I do think American culture still has like such a bold thread through so many different countries. Like if you think, if we were tying it back to fashion, for example, like jeans, for example, is an American phenomenon. And you see jeans literally everywhere. Like everyone has their own adaptations. Like it's literally all over the world. I always think that's really interesting. Or like branded clothing. That was something that became popular in America. And I feel like even when I've gone to India, even in the most rural areas, that somehow like trickle down into their own style, but it comes back to like that branded clothing in the United States.
Since your podcast is about hot takes and having hot takes on pop culture, kind of like what is your hot take on all of this and just American versus Australian culture?
I think, I know you said that a lot of your friends preferred Australian versions of different TV shows. In my personal opinion, I find that a lot of Australian media, especially reality TV, seems like a recycled version of, a lot of Australian media seems like a very recycled version of American media. So for example, take a reality TV show such as The Bachelor. That was something that obviously, I think it began in America, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then that was something that was taken from America, and it was sort of adapted into like a more Australian format, sort of a more Australian themed show, but it still felt like an off-brand version of the American Bachelor and the Bachelorette. Like I'd always tell my friends, oh no, you got to watch the American one, it's so much better. And I'm not sure why that is, but it was just, it felt a bit cheaper, is that the right word? I'm not sure. It was very
More tacky.
yeah, maybe that's the right word. It felt like it was a clear knockoff. It didn't feel very authentic. It felt like it was kind of just taking something that already existed and just replicating it, but failing to, obviously, because it's not the same.
Well, I think is something like The Bachelor, for example, why it's so successful in the United States And the first time I thought about this was because they brought Love Island, like the whole concept and show, to the United States, and Catherine refuses to watch it. But
Oh, the American one's so bad. I'm sorry.
it's like
Yeah.
it's so bad that I enjoy it.
Like I prefer to watch only the UK one.
That's what I think is interesting, is that because it's not American, I feel like a lot of
Yeah.
Americans kind of give it more weight in its
Yeah.
value, which I don't think is true at all. And so I think the comparison is really, really interesting because it's like kind of like the same things. And sometimes in the British one, like I don't think as many Americans understand the like actual meaning of some of the slang, because a lot of it is just like a part of their old like culture, and just like things that have been said. Like I just think about like some of the stuff that, or like what I wasn't allowed to say as a kid, and what I
You
would
weren't
hear
allowed to say some of their slang?
well, we didn't speak slang in our household, so yeah.
Oh.
But like what my cousins weren't allowed to say and stuff like that. And so then to see people think like, oh, that's so funny, or like not really understand the weight of it. It's kind of bizarre to say, because even though we're all speaking the English language, there's just so many different like nuances to it.
I just think it's funny.
Anyways,
There's no American slang that we don't know, but then from like Australia and Britain, there's like slang that is.
like, you know how the seasons are kind of like the opposite to how it is in the United States, but the fashion cycle kind of runs on like these seasons, like fall, winter, and like spring, summer, and stuff like that. Does that influence what's being sold in stores, or is it mostly like catered towards the weather there? So like right now, are there summer clothing
Yeah,
in
yeah, it's
stores?
definitely catered towards the weather here, for
Okay.
sure.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting also, like a lot of the main stores that we have in Australia are like Australian brands and Australian owned brands. Um, that being said, a lot of shopping for like our specific demographic, like young adults, teenagers, especially like women, it's very much online. And then in that case, it's obviously different because a lot of online retailers obviously tailor towards like the Americans in terms of like seasons and that. It's also kind of great because you know how, I mean, you guys would know more about this than me, but when it comes to a new season, then the stuff from the old season kind of goes on sale. Like when it gets to summer, like all the boots and stuff in like shoe stores are on sale. So we can use that to our advantage because when summer's ending in America, it's starting in Australia. And so we can just get a bunch of summer stuff on sale online as opposed to paying like full price. So yeah, that's for sure an advantage.
Yeah.
So one question we like to ask all of our guests is, what is your favorite statement piece?
I'm really into like baggy jeans and like baggy clothes at the moment. Like um, like the big, you know how they say like small, big, 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 like in terms of like different clothing. I'm very into the big, big look and like oversized t-shirts and graphic tees over like a turtleneck. Like that's kind of my style at the moment because comfort. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being
Yeah,
on our
thank you.
podcast.
That was so nice. Thank you for having me.